Niagara Falls, today, is frozen in the public imagination as something timeless, a place of romance and postcards, a thunderous curtain of water framed by railings, observation decks, souvenir shops, and flashing cameras. Millions of visitors arrive each year to witness what appears to be one of nature's purest spectacles, raw, eternal, and untouched. But this image is a lie of omission, because a century ago, Niagara Falls was not defined by tourism. It was defined by ambition, by steel, by machinery, by the relentless belief that nature itself could be bent, tunneled, and forced to work. At the height of its industrial power, Niagara Falls was not just a waterfall, it was the beating heart of North American energy production. The electricity that lit cities, powered factories, and fueled modern life did not simply flow from the river's surface. It was stolen from below. Hidden beneath the pathways where tourists now stand, beneath the manicured parks and viewing platforms, lies a vast underground world. A forgotten network of tunnels, some large enough to walk through, others tall enough to swallow entire buildings. These passages were carved directly into solid rock, engineered with 19th and early 20th century precision, and designed to move unimaginable volumes of water in total secrecy. Most visitors never sense them. There are no signs, no plaques, no glass floors revealing what lies beneath their feet. Yet below the roar of falling water, below the laughter and clicking cameras, entire systems of abandoned infrastructure remain sealed, flooded, and slowly dissolving into darkness. So how did one of the most recognizable natural landmarks on Earth become the site of one of the largest hidden industrial complexes ever built? Why were these tunnels constructed in the first place at enormous cost, risk, and human labor? Why were they abandoned, sealed off, and erased from public memory? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what still remains down there? The story of Niagara Falls is not just a story of geology or beauty. It is a story of control, of an era when engineers believed rivers could be disciplined like machines, when governments and corporations raced to extract power before their rivals did, when the line between natural wonder and industrial weapon blurred beyond recognition. These tunnels were not accidents. They were not minor side projects. They were the unseen arteries of an energy empire designed to operate out of sight, out of mind, and beneath the very symbol they were exploiting. Today, Niagara Falls appears unchanged. The water still falls, the mist still rises, but the ground beneath tells a different story, one of buried ambition, forgotten labor, and technological triumphs that outlived their creators. This is not the Niagara Falls you were taught to see. This is the Niagara Falls beneath the surface. And to understand it, we must descend into the abandoned tunnels no one was meant to remember. Long before turbines, tunnels, and transmission lines carved their way beneath the river, Niagara Falls existed in a different human imagination, one shaped not by profit, but by fear, reverence, and awe. The earliest known European account of Niagara Falls dates to 1678, when French explorer and missionary Father Louis Hennepin published one of the first written descriptions of the site. What he encountered was not a destination. It was not a spectacle designed for admiration. It was something far more unsettling. Hennepin described Niagara as frightful and astonishing, a place where the river hurled itself downward with terrifying force. His words emphasized scale, violence, and power. The sound alone, he wrote, was overwhelming. The mist rose like smoke from a battlefield. The ground trembled. For Europeans encountering the falls for the first time, Niagara did not feel beautiful. It felt dangerous, untamable. And that reaction was not unusual. For the indigenous peoples who lived near the river long before European arrival, Niagara held spiritual meaning rather than economic value. It was a place of stories, boundaries, and respect, something to be acknowledged, not exploited. The river was alive. The falls were not obstacles to conquer, but forces to coexist with. For the next 2 centuries after Hennepin's account, that perspective largely held. Niagara Falls remained, above all else, a geographic landmark, a fixed point on maps, a natural boundary between territories, a reference for travelers moving through the region. Small settlements formed gradually on both the American and Canadian sides of the river, but they were modest in scale and limited in ambition. Life near the falls adapted to the landscape rather than attempting to dominate it. There were no grand engineering schemes, no underground passages, no attempts to redirect the river's flow. The technology simply did not exist, and perhaps more importantly, the mindset did not either. During the 17th and 18th centuries, water power was understood in simple, local terms. Small mills used streams and creeks. Rivers were navigational routes or natural barriers. Niagara, by contrast, was too vast, too violent, and too unpredictable to be treated as a tool. It was something to observe from a distance, not to harness. Even as the Industrial Revolution began reshaping Europe and parts of North America, Niagara remained largely untouched. Its remoteness, scale, and lack of infrastructure protected it from early exploitation. The falls inspired artists, writers, and explorers, not engineers. To early visitors, Niagara symbolized the rawness of the New World itself, a reminder that nature still held dominance, that there were forces beyond calculation, beyond control. This perception endured well into the early 19th century. While cities grew, factories expanded, and machines multiplied elsewhere, Niagara remained on the margins of industrial ambition. It was famous, but not yet useful, impressive, but not yet profitable. And that distinction mattered. Because once Niagara ceased to be viewed as untouchable, once it was redefined not as a wonder, but as a resource, everything changed. The moment humans stopped asking, "What is this place?" and started asking, "How much power can it produce?" marked the beginning of a transformation that would permanently alter the landscape above and below the ground. But in this earlier era, Niagara was still whole. The river ran unrestrained. The rock beneath remained uncut. The underground world was silent, unbroken, and unknown. It was a time before gates and gradients, before conduits and discharge tunnels, before engineers measured waterfalls not in beauty, but in horsepower. This was Niagara before it was disciplined, before it was divided, before it was hollowed out from within, and it would not last. By the middle of the 19th century, the way humans looked at Niagara Falls began to change quietly at first, then all at once. This was an age defined by machines. Across the United States and British Canada, industry was accelerating at a pace never seen before. Steam engines roared in factories. Railroads stitched continents together. Cities expanded, demanding energy not in symbols, but in measurable force. And in this new industrial mindset, nature was no longer something to admire from a distance. It was something to be used. To engineers and investors of the era, Niagara Falls was no longer just a waterfall. It was stored motion, a constant, renewable surge of mechanical energy, pouring endlessly through a narrow corridor of rock. The question was no longer whether it could be controlled, but how. And once that question was asked, the transformation became inevitable. In the mid-19th century, both American and Canadian interests began to see the Niagara River as a controllable system. Not a single, chaotic force, but a sequence of flows that could be divided, redirected, measured, and exploited. The idea was simple in theory. Divert a portion of the river upstream, channel it through engineered pathways, extract its energy, then return the water downstream. In practice, this required something unprecedented. It required cutting into solid rock. The first decisive step came in 1853, on the American side of the river, with the construction of the hydraulic canal by the Falls Hydraulic Power and Manufacturing Company. This was not a tunnel at first, but a wide, open canal carved into the land. designed to carry water away from the river before it reached the falls. Completed in 1861, the canal fed a growing cluster of early industrial operations. Mills sprang up along its length, paper mills, flour mills, and later chemical processing facilities. These factories tapped directly into the moving water, channeling it downward into wheel pits where massive water wheels converted flow into rotational force. For the first time in Niagara's history, the river was no longer running freely. It was being scheduled. The success of the canal triggered a rapid transformation. What had once been a quiet geographic landmark became the first concentrated industrial district at Niagara Falls. Smokestacks rose above the gorge. Brick factories crowded the riverbanks. The sound of machinery joined the thunder of the falls. But the real revolution wasn't visible from the surface. It was happening underground. To make these systems work efficiently, engineers began carving mill-race tunnels directly into the bedrock. These narrow passages carried water from the canal to the wheel pits, then sloped downward toward the gorge, accelerating the flow through gravity alone. After driving the machinery, the water was expelled through stone-lined outfalls hidden in the cliff walls. These were not small undertakings. Crews worked by lantern light, using chisels, picks, and early blasting powder to cut through layers of Lockport dolomite and shale. The tunnels were typically 8 to 12 feet high, just large enough for workers to enter for maintenance. Some were hand-cut. Others were blasted into shape. All of them represented a radical shift in how humans interacted with the landscape. Niagara was no longer just being shaped from above. It was being hollowed from within. For decades, this underground network expanded quietly beneath the factories. As mills upgraded equipment, tunnels were widened or reshaped. Additional shafts were added. New passages connected old ones. What emerged was a patchwork of interconnected voids beneath the industrial district, a hidden infrastructure supporting everything above it. And for a time, it worked. The system powered factories, created jobs, and turned Niagara Falls into one of North America's most productive industrial zones. Water, once feared and revered, had been converted into mechanical authority. Control over flow meant control over production. Control over production meant wealth. But embedded in this success was a fragile truth. These early systems were built for a world powered by water wheels, not electricity. And as the 19th century drew to a close, a new form of energy was rising, one that would demand far more from the river and from the rock beneath it. The hydraulic canal had opened the door. What came next would drive engineers deeper underground, toward tunnels larger, longer, and more ambitious than anything built before. This was only the beginning. Long before Niagara Falls became synonymous with electricity, it was already hiding a world beneath its surface. By the late 19th century, while factories crowded, the riverbanks and smokestacks defined the skyline, an entirely separate landscape was taking shape below ground, cut directly into the living rock. This was the first underground Niagara, a mechanical underworld built not for people, but for water. These were the mill tunnels, the earliest generation of subterranean infrastructure at Niagara Falls, and though primitive by modern standards, they were revolutionary for their time. The geology dictated everything. Engineers were forced to carve through layers of Lockport dolomite, a dense, resilient limestone that formed the structural backbone of the region, and beneath it, bands of shale, softer, more unstable, and prone to erosion when exposed to moving water. Every foot of progress required careful judgment. Cut too aggressively, and the tunnel could collapse. Reinforce too heavily, and construction slowed to a crawl. There were no tunnel boring machines, no electric drills, no automated supports. Most of the work was done by hand. Laborers swung chisels and picks for hours at a time, working by lantern light in damp, airless conditions. Where the rock proved too stubborn, crews used early blasting powders, carefully packed into drilled holes and detonated in controlled bursts. The process was slow, dangerous, and physically brutal, but it worked. What emerged from this effort were tunnels typically 8 to 12 feet high, just wide enough for maintenance workers to enter and for water to pass in powerful, confined streams. These passages were not designed for comfort. They were designed for efficiency. Each tunnel served a precise mechanical purpose. Water diverted from the hydraulic canal entered the system through manually controlled gates. Mill operators adjusted these gates by hand, regulating how much water flowed into each tunnel depending on demand. From there, gravity did the rest. The tunnels sloped downward toward massive vertical chambers known as wheel pits. Inside these pits, enormous water wheels weighted wooden at first, later iron designed to convert falling water into rotational force. As the water struck the wheel blades, motion was transferred upward through shafts into the factories above, driving belts, gears, and entire production lines. After its energy was spent, the water didn't simply pool or spill back into the canal. It vanished. From the wheel pits, discharge water flowed into a second set of tunnels, tail race passages that carried it away from the factories and expelled it through stone-lined outfalls carved directly into the gorge walls. These outfalls were often invisible from above, hidden behind mist, rock, and vegetation. To the casual observer standing at the edge of the falls, nothing seemed unusual. But beneath their feet, thousands of gallons of water were racing through darkness every second. As industries expanded, so did this underground system. New factories meant new wheel pits. New wheel pits required new tunnels. Over time, passages were widened, redirected, or reshaped to accommodate upgraded machinery. Some tunnels intersected. Others ran parallel. Vertical shafts connected multiple levels. What formed was not a single tunnel, but a network. A patchwork of interconnected voids stretched beneath the industrial district, threading its way through rock like veins beneath skin. Workers moved through these passages to inspect gates, clear debris, and reinforce weakened sections. Yet for all its scale and importance, this underground city remained largely unseen. It had no streets, no signs, no public entrances, only function. For decades, the mill tunnels operated continuously, day and night, winter and summer. As long as the river flowed, the tunnels lived. But their very success carried the seeds of their decline. By the 1,890 seconds, water wheels were becoming obsolete. Electricity cleaner, more flexible, and capable of traveling long distances was replacing mechanical transmission. Factories abandoned their wheel pits, gates were closed, water was redirected elsewhere, and when water stopped moving, the tunnels began to die. Without constant flow, sediment accumulated. Moisture weakened the rock. Timber supports rotted. In some cases, collapses damaged the buildings above, forcing owners to seal off the tunnels entirely. By the early 20th century, many mill tunnels were already marked as disused on maps, forgotten remnants of an earlier industrial age. Yet they were never removed. They were simply left behind, flooded, filled with rubble, buried beneath redevelopment, an invisible city, sealed inside stone. And while these early tunnels would fade into obscurity, they had proven something essential, that Niagara Falls could be industrialized not just on the surface, but underground. What came next would take this idea to an entirely new scale, one that would reshape the river, the rock, and the future of energy itself. By the 1,890 seconds, the world beneath Niagara Falls began to fall silent. For nearly half a century, mechanical power had ruled the river. Water wheels turned without rest, shafts groaned under load, tunnels thundered with controlled force. But technological progress, once unleashed, does not slow, it replaces. And at Niagara, electricity was about to erase an entire underground civilization. The transition happened faster than anyone expected. As alternating current proved its superiority during the War of Currents, factory owners faced a stark reality. Mechanical transmission was no longer competitive. Water wheels tied production to location. Shafts wasted energy. Maintenance was constant. Expansion was limited. Electric motors changed everything. They were compact, flexible, powerful, and they didn't require massive wheel pits carved into bedrock. By the early 1890s, mills and factories began dismantling their mechanical systems. Water wheels were pulled apart, drive shafts were removed, belts went slack. One by one, the wheel pits were abandoned. At first, the change seemed harmless. Gates were simply closed. Water was redirected. Tunnels that had operated continuously for decades suddenly stood idle. But underground systems are not designed to rest. Without flowing water, sediment began to settle along tunnel floors. Organic debris accumulated at intakes. Moisture seeped into fractures in the rock. Timber supports installed during early construction started to rot. Freeze-thaw cycles widened cracks in the dolomite and shale. Neglect accelerated decay. In some locations, blocked tunnels caused pressure to build during seasonal surges, forcing water into unintended paths. This led to sinkholes, flooding, and even structural damage to factories above. What had once been an asset became a liability. By the turn of the century, engineers and city planners recognized a hard truth. The old mechanical tunnels were no longer worth saving. Maps from the 1920s tell the story clearly. Entire sections of the underground system were marked with a single damning word: disused. No maintenance schedules, no access routes, no records of condition. These tunnels were no longer infrastructure, they were relics. And as Niagara entered a new phase of industrial redevelopment, there was little patience for relics. During the 1930s and 1940s, the region underwent significant transformation. Aging factories were demolished. New buildings rose in their place. Roads were widened. Foundations were reinforced. And everywhere redevelopment occurred, the underground world was in the way. The solution was simple and permanent. Tunnels were deliberately filled with rubble and construction debris to stabilize the ground. Others were sealed with concrete bulkheads. Some were crushed outright during regrading, their ceilings collapsing under the weight of modern construction. There was no ceremony, no preservation effort, no public debate. The underground city was erased not by disaster but by indifference. By mid-century, only fragments remained. Hidden voids beneath warehouses, isolated chambers beneath parking lots, arched cavities detectable only by ground-penetrating radar, their entrances lost, their exits buried, their purpose forgotten. Above ground, Niagara Falls was reinventing itself. Tourism expanded. Scenic overlooks multiplied. The narrative shifted from industry to spectacle, from power generation to natural wonder. Visitors came for beauty, not machinery. The river was framed as timeless and untouched, even as its past was entombed beneath concrete and stone. Few realized that beneath their footsteps lay the bones of an industrial empire. The mechanical age had built Niagara's first underground world. Electricity made it obsolete, and progress, relentless and unsentimental, sealed it away. But this was not the end of Niagara's subterranean story. It was only the end of its first chapter. Because electricity didn't eliminate the need for tunnels, it demanded bigger ones, deeper ones, more powerful ones. And soon, engineers would return to the rock, not to abandon it, but to carve something far more ambitious beneath the falls. Something that would make the old mill tunnels look insignificant by comparison. The age of mechanics had collapsed. The age of industrial electricity was about to descend underground. By the early 1890s, Niagara Falls stood at the center of a conflict that had nothing to do with nations or armies and everything to do with ideas. The mechanical age had reached its limit. Water wheels could no longer meet the ambitions of a rapidly electrifying world. What Niagara needed was not more force, but a new way to move energy itself. And that question, how electricity should be generated and transmitted, ignited one of the most consequential technological battles in history, the War of Currents. On one side stood Thomas Edison, the most famous inventor in America. Edison championed direct current, DC, a system that delivered electricity at a constant voltage. It worked well over short distances and powered early lighting systems in major cities. But DC had a fatal flaw. It couldn't travel far. Voltage dropped quickly. Transmission losses mounted. To power a city, DC required power stations every few miles, an impossible limitation for large-scale industry. On the other side stood Nikola Tesla, a brilliant and unconventional engineer whose ideas challenged everything Edison believed. Tesla argued for alternating current, a system where electricity periodically reversed direction. With transformers, AC could be stepped up to high voltages for long-distance transmission, then stepped down safely for use. Edison didn't just disagree. He attacked. In a brutal public campaign, Edison portrayed AC as dangerous and uncontrollable. He staged demonstrations, electrocuting animals with AC power to instill fear. He lobbied lawmakers. He weaponized public opinion. But physics was not on his side. As industries grew and cities expanded, the need for long-distance transmission became undeniable. And nowhere was that need more visible than at Niagara Falls. The river possessed immense power, but its greatest industrial value lay miles away, in cities like Buffalo. The challenge was no longer how to generate electricity, but how to send it across distance without losing it along the way. In 1890, the International Niagara Commission, chaired by the legendary physicist Lord Kelvin, was formed to decide the future of the falls. Proposals poured in from around the world. Every system was tested. Every claim scrutinized. 3 years later, in 1893, the verdict was clear. Westinghouse Electric, using Tesla's AC design, won the contract. It was more than a business decision. It was a declaration that alternating current would define the modern world. Construction soon began on Adams Power Plant. The first full-scale alternating current hydroelectric station ever built. Unlike earlier facilities, this was not an experiment. It was a statement of intent, a machine designed to operate continuously, at unprecedented scale. Above ground, the generating hall rose near the American Falls, housing massive turbines and generators. But its true innovation lay beneath. Deep underground, water was routed through vertical penstocks into turbines buried far below the surface. From there, it was expelled through a carefully engineered tailrace tunnel, allowing the plant to operate without flooding or disrupting the landscape above. When Adams No. 1 came online in 1895, electricity flowed locally for the first time. But the real test came the following year. On the 16th of November, 1896, power generated at Niagara Falls reached Buffalo 26 miles away. It worked. The moment was historic. Newspapers across the world reported the achievement. Tesla's theories were vindicated. Westinghouse secured dominance in electrical infrastructure. Edison's DC system, once dominant, began its slow retreat. Niagara Falls had proven that electricity could be transmitted over long distances reliably, efficiently, and at industrial scale. This was not just a technological victory, it was a transformation of civilization. Factories no longer had to sit beside rivers. Cities could grow outward instead of clustering around power sources. Energy became mobile, invisible, omnipresent. And beneath Niagara Falls, a new underground world took shape far larger and more sophisticated than anything that had come before. The War of Currents ended not with a surrender, but with a legacy. Alternating current became the backbone of global electrification, and Niagara Falls, once carved by mechanical tunnels, became the birthplace of the modern electrical age. Humanity had learned not just how to harness nature, but how to rewrite the rules of power itself. Beneath the roar of Niagara Falls, hidden behind stone and mist, lay the true heart of the electrical revolution. Not the generators, not the turbines, but a tunnel. The Adams Tail Race Tunnel was not designed to be seen. It carried no plaques, no monuments, no visitors. Yet without it, the most important hydroelectric experiment in history would have failed before it began. This was the unseen engine that made alternating current possible at Niagara Falls. When engineers began planning Adams' power plant, no, 1 inch, the early 1,890 seconds, they quickly realized that generating electricity was only half the problem. The real challenge lay in controlling what happened after the water passed through the turbines. Spent water had to be removed rapidly, safely, and continuously. If it backed up, the turbines would flood. If it disturbed the surface, erosion and instability would follow. The solution demanded something unprecedented: a massive underground discharge tunnel, carved directly through the gorge wall. Excavation of the Adams Tail Race began in 1890, shortly after Westinghouse secured the contract. Crews faced an unforgiving task: cutting a 1,400-foot-long passage through layers of dolomite and shale while maintaining a precise downward gradient. Too steep, and the water would destabilize the structure. Too shallow, and it would stall. The tunnel's dimensions were extraordinary for its time. It stood approximately 18 to 20 feet high, with a horseshoe-shaped cross-section, a design chosen for its balance of hydraulic efficiency and structural strength. The curved arch distributed pressure evenly into the surrounding rock, while the flat base allowed sediment to pass without accumulating. Construction methods were a blend of brute force and precision. Workers drilled holes by hand, packed them with controlled dynamite charges, and reinforced vulnerable sections with timber bracing. In areas where the rock proved unstable, brick and stone linings were installed, course by course, to prevent collapse. Every foot forward required constant surveying, measurement, and adjustment. Above the tunnel, the generating hall rose unaware, perhaps, of how dependent it was on the void below. At the upstream end, the tail race connected directly to 12 vertical penstocks. These massive shafts delivered water from the upper river down into turbines buried deep beneath the powerhouse floor. As the turbines extracted energy from the flow, the spent water surged into the tail race tunnel at tremendous speed. The volume was staggering. At full operation, the Adams Tail Race carried tens of thousands of gallons of water per second, rushing through darkness with controlled violence. Yet despite the force, the tunnel remained stable, channeling the river without disturbing the land above. When the system became operational in 1895, it worked exactly as intended. But the true test came a year later. On the 16th of November, 1896, electricity generated above the Adams Tail Race traveled 26 miles to Buffalo, the first long-distance high-voltage AC transmission in history. What made this achievement possible was not just Tesla's mathematics or Westinghouse's generators. It was the tunnel. The tail race ensured uninterrupted operation. It allowed turbines to run continuously without flooding or mechanical failure. It stabilized the entire system, transforming a bold idea into a reliable industrial reality. The world celebrated the visible victory, electric lights glowing in Buffalo, factories humming with new power. But beneath Niagara Falls, the real triumph flowed unseen. For more than 6 decades, the Adams Tail Race remained in continuous use. While the generating hall above underwent upgrades and maintenance, the tunnel performed its silent duty year after year, enduring pressure, erosion, and time itself. It was the artery of the world's first electrical superpower, and yet, like so much of Niagara's underground world, it would eventually be forgotten. When new treaties reshaped water rights and larger, more efficient power plants emerged upstream, Adams one became obsolete. In 1961, the plant was decommissioned, The penstocks were sealed. The intake was blocked with reinforced concrete. The tunnel fell silent. Slowly, groundwater seeped in. The tail race flooded, becoming a submerged chamber preserved only by the strength of the surrounding rock. Above it, life went on. Tourists walked past, unaware that beneath them lay the hidden engine of a technological revolution. The Adams tail race tunnel was never meant to inspire awe, yet it changed history. Invisible, essential, indispensable. A reminder that the greatest victories are often built in places no one ever sees. By the mid-20th century, the machinery beneath Niagara Falls had not failed. It had been outgrown. For decades, the Adams power system stood as a symbol of industrial triumph, proof that human ingenuity could tame one of nature's most powerful forces. But progress does not honor pioneers. It replaces them. And in the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, the balance of power at Niagara Falls began to shift decisively. The river was no longer governed solely by private companies or regional interests. Instead, it became the subject of international negotiation. U.S. Canada water treaties redefined how much water could be diverted for power generation, when it could be used, and by whom. These agreements were designed to protect the visual beauty of the falls, regulate cross-border usage, and centralize control over one of North America's most valuable natural resources. But they carried an unintended consequence. They rendered older power stations obsolete. Newer facilities, larger, deeper, and far more efficient, were already waiting upstream. The most significant of these was the Robert Moses Niagara Power Plant, a massive public works project built to dwarf everything that had come before it. Unlike Adams, the Robert Moses plant was designed for a new era. Its tunnels were longer. Its water drop was greater. Its turbines were more powerful. And critically, it operated under state-managed water rights, granting it priority access to the river's flow. Against this scale, Adams' power plant one could not compete. By the late 1,950 seconds, the decision was inevitable. In 1961, the Adams station was formally decommissioned. The shutdown was methodical and final. The penstocks were sealed. Turbines were powered down. Electrical equipment was removed or scrapped. Most importantly, the intake to the Adams tail race tunnel was blocked with reinforced concrete, cutting the lifeline that had sustained the system for over 60 years. With no moving water, the tunnel began to change. Groundwater seeped in through hairline fractures in the rock. Seasonal pressure forced moisture into the lining. Slowly, deliberately, the tail race filled. What had once been a roaring artery of industrial power became a flooded chamber, sealed off from the world above. There were no headlines, no protests, no commemorations. The system that had once electrified cities was abandoned in near silence. Above ground, the Adams Station building remained, its brick facade still standing near the American Falls. Tourists passed by, often unaware of what it once housed. The generators were gone, the turbines buried, the tunnel beneath it, invisible and forgotten. On the Canadian side, similar stories unfolded. Private hydroelectric companies, once dominant, were steadily eclipsed by large public projects. Their tunnels were sealed, their intakes closed, their underground works left to flood under hydrostatic pressure. Remote inspections conducted decades later revealed something unexpected. Despite decades of abandonment, many of these tunnels remained structurally sound. Brick linings held, arched ceilings endured, preserved not by maintenance but by the very rock they had been carved into. Time had entombed them, not destroyed them. Niagara Falls had entered a new phase. The river was now governed by treaties, centralized infrastructure, and mega-projects built for scale rather than ingenuity. The early underground systems, once marvels of engineering, became footnotes in a larger narrative. Yet beneath the surface, they still existed, dark, silent, submerged. a hidden record of an era when electricity was new, ambition was raw, and engineers dared to carve the future directly into stone. The power had changed hands, but the tunnels remained, waiting quietly for history to remember them. The underground cathedrals of industry. While the American side of Niagara Falls often dominates popular memory, with its early experiments, famous inventors, and headline-making power plants, the true scale of subterranean ambition emerged north of the border. Because on the Canadian side, engineers did not merely copy what had been done before. They expanded it deeper into the earth, farther beneath the river, and on a scale that bordered on monumental. This is the story of the Ontario Power Company and the vast underground world it left behind. A new century, a new vision. By the dawn of the 20th century, Niagara Falls was no longer an experiment. It was a proven engine of power. Electricity had transformed from novelty into necessity. Cities expanded, industries multiplied. Demand surged far beyond what the early plants on either side of the border could supply. Canada, watching closely as American companies extracted enormous economic value from the river, reached a decisive conclusion. Niagara Falls was not just a natural wonder. It was strategic infrastructure. In 1904, the Ontario Power Company was chartered with a singular mandate: build a hydroelectric system capable of rivaling and ultimately surpassing anything constructed to the south. From the beginning, the company rejected half measures. If water was to be diverted, it would be diverted efficiently. If tunnels were to be built, they would be built deep. If power was to be generated, it would be done at a continental scale. The result was one of the most ambitious underground industrial projects of the early 20th century. Digging deeper than ever before, unlike earlier mill tunnels or even the Adams tail race, the Ontario Power Company's system was conceived as a single integrated underground complex, not a collection of ad hoc channels. At its heart was a massive tail race tunnel stretching over 2,000 feet beneath the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. This tunnel was not shallow. It was carved deep into layers of dolomite bedrock, far below the surface and in places far below the river itself. Why go so deep? Because depth meant control. The deeper the tunnel, the greater the hydraulic head, the vertical drop that determines how much energy can be extracted from flowing water. By placing turbines far below the intake level, engineers could extract vastly more power from the same volume of water. But this design came at a cost. Excavation at such depths was slow, dangerous, and unforgiving. A war against stone construction crews faced a brutal geological reality. Niagara's subsurface is not uniform. Layers of dolomite, limestone, and shale alternate unpredictably. Some sections were stable and cooperative, others fractured under pressure, collapsing without warning. The tunnel was excavated using a combination of hand-drilling pneumatic tools, black powder and early dynamite, brick and concrete lining installed section by section. There were no tunnel-boring machines. Every foot was won by human labor. Crews worked by dim electric lamps, breathing dust and explosive residue, surrounded by the constant threat of cave-ins or flooding. Ventilation was limited. Escape routes were few. Progress was measured not in miles but in inches per day. Yet the tunnel advanced, because this was not merely a construction project. It was a declaration of intent. The underground powerhouse. At the end of this immense tail race system lay the powerhouse itself, an architectural and engineering marvel, much of it hidden beneath the surface. The Ontario Power Company facility housed 15 turbines, each massive by the standards of the time. Water entered through penstocks descending from intake canals above, plunging downward into the turbines with tremendous force. The spent water then exited into the tail race tunnel, which carried it away beneath the gorge before returning it downstream to the Niagara River. The materials used reflected both ambition and permanence. brick for structural lining, reinforced concrete for load-bearing sections, dolomite rock left exposed in areas where natural strength exceeded any man-made substitute. These were not temporary structures. They were designed to last a century or more. The interior spaces, vast, vaulted, and echoing, felt less like industrial corridors and more like subterranean cathedrals. High arched ceilings, long, straight sightlines, columns of masonry disappearing into darkness. This was industry expressed as architecture. Power without precedent. When fully operational, the Ontario Power Company plant delivered electricity on a scale that redefined Canadian industry. Factories across Ontario drew power from Niagara. Streetlights illuminated cities. Rail systems expanded. Entire regional economies began to orbit the steady pulse of hydroelectric current flowing from beneath the falls. Niagara Falls had become more than a border landmark. It was the beating heart of a growing nation's infrastructure. And yet, for most citizens, the true source of this power remained unseen. They admired the falls. They never saw the tunnels. A hidden world below the tourists above ground. The Canadian side of Niagara evolved into a destination. Hotels rose. Observation decks expanded. Roads and promenades brought millions of visitors within feet of the water's edge. Below them, separated by layers of rock and concrete, the Ontario Power Company's tunnels continued their silent labor. Tourists stood at viewpoints, unaware that thousands of gallons of water per second were racing beneath their feet. Turbines larger than railway cars spun in darkness below. A man-made underground river mirrored the natural one above. This duality defined Niagara for most of the 20th century. Beauty above, industry below, and almost no overlap between the two worlds. The slow turn toward obsolescence. As decades passed, the logic that once justified the Ontario Power Company's dominance began to erode. Technology advanced. New power stations, larger, more centralized, and designed for even greater efficiency, emerged across Canada. Transmission networks improved, reducing reliance on any single generating site. By the late 20th century, Niagara's early giants faced a familiar fate. They were no longer essential. In 1999, after nearly a century of operation, the Ontario Power Company facility was officially shut down. But unlike earlier closures, this one occurred under the watchful eye of modern engineers, historians, and regulators. This was not abandonment through neglect, it was retirement by design. Sealing the underground cathedrals. The shutdown process was deliberate. Turbines were halted. Electrical systems disconnected. Access points sealed. Intakes closed. As with earlier systems, water slowly reclaimed the underground spaces. But something remarkable occurred. The tunnels did not collapse. They did not disintegrate. They endured. Subsequent inspections conducted using submersible cameras and remote sensing revealed that much of the tunnel system remained structurally intact decades after flooding. Brick linings still held. Concrete arches resisted pressure. Dolomite walls stood firm. The very depth that once made construction so difficult now protected the tunnels from surface interference, vibration, and erosion. They became time capsules, an industrial. Afterlife today, the Ontario Power Company tunnels exist in a strange state between past and present. They are no longer functional. They are rarely accessible. They are officially sealed and submerged. Yet they remain one of the largest preserved underground industrial systems ever constructed beneath a natural wonder. Historians who have studied the site describe it in reverent terms, not as ruins, but as monuments. These tunnels represent a moment when humanity believed that progress could be carved directly into the earth, permanent, unyielding, and righteous. They are reminders of an era when engineers thought in stone, not software, when power meant water, gravity, and depth, scale beyond memory. What sets the Canadian side apart is not merely size, but philosophy. Where early American systems were often experimental and fragmented, the Ontario Power Company pursued total integration. Every tunnel, turbine, and channel was part of a unified vision, a single underground machine. That machine no longer runs, but it has not disappeared. It sleeps beneath Niagara Falls, silent, flooded, and intact. A vast, unseen architecture. A cathedral not to faith but to force, flow, and human ambition. And perhaps most haunting of all, millions walk above it every year, listening to the thunder of falling water, never realizing that below them lies an even older thunder frozen in stone. The one tunnel that came back to life. For more than a century, the underground world beneath Niagara Falls followed a single, unbroken trajectory. It was built, it was used, it was sealed, and then it was forgotten. Mill tunnels collapsed or were buried. Tail races flooded and vanished into darkness. Powerhouses shut down, their arteries of stone and concrete left to sleep beneath the river. History seemed settled. Humanity had moved on, until unexpectedly one tunnel refused to stay buried. A different kind of power company. The story begins in 1907 with the Toronto Power Company, a firm that entered Niagara's hydroelectric race slightly later than its rivals, but with a distinctive approach. Rather than building sprawling surface complexes, Toronto Power invested heavily underground. Its defining feature was a 2,200-foot tailrace tunnel, carved deep beneath the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, channeling spent water back to the river far downstream. The tunnel was massive for its time, tall enough for rail carts and maintenance crews, wide enough to handle enormous water volumes lined with brick and concrete designed for longevity, not speed. Unlike earlier mill tunnels, this was not improvisation. It was mature hydroelectric engineering, precise, deliberate, and confident. For decades, the system worked flawlessly, feeding electricity into Ontario's growing grid while remaining almost entirely invisible to the public above. The long silence. But progress is ruthless. By the mid-20th century, newer power stations, larger, more centralized, and more efficient, made Toronto Power's facility redundant. In 1974, the plant was officially shut down. Water was diverted elsewhere. Generators went silent. Access points were sealed. The tunnel entered the familiar pattern: darkness, stillness, oblivion. For nearly half a century, the Toronto Power Tunnel existed only in blueprints, engineering reports, and fading institutional memory. It was assumed, like so many others, that it would never be seen again. An unexpected decision. Then, something unprecedented happened. In the late 2010 seconds, Parks Canada and heritage engineers began reassessing Niagara's industrial past, not as obsolete infrastructure, but as cultural legacy. Most underground systems were too dangerous, too flooded, or too degraded to even consider reopening. But the Toronto Power Tunnel was different. Surveys revealed exceptional structural integrity, minimal collapse or deformation, brick linings still intact, manageable water intrusion. In short, it was salvageable. What followed was a decision without historical precedent. Instead of sealing the tunnel forever, they would bring it back. The restoration, 2021, 2023. Between 2021 and 2023, a painstaking restoration project unfolded. The goal was not to reactivate power generation. It was something far rarer: to allow humans to walk back into the industrial underworld. Engineers drained sections of the tunnel, stabilized walls, reinforced vulnerable areas, and installed modern safety systems, lighting, walkways, ventilation, and emergency exits. Crucially, they preserved the tunnel's original character. This was not a theme park. The brick remained scarred. The concrete bore water stains. The scale remained overwhelming. Visitors would not be protected from history. They would confront it. Walking into the underworld. When the tunnel opened to the public, it marked a singular moment. For the first time in Niagara's history, ordinary people descended into the hidden infrastructure beneath the falls. As visitors walk the length of the tunnel today, the experience is profoundly disorienting. The roar of Niagara is still present but muted, distant, filtered through stone. The air is cool and heavy, the walls curve away into darkness beyond the lights. You are standing where water once raced past at terrifying speed. You are inside a machine that helped power a nation. This is not a reconstruction. It is the real thing. Why this one survived? The obvious question is, why this tunnel? Why did Toronto Power's system become the only underground world to return, while all others remained sealed or lost? The answer lies at the intersection of engineering and chance. It was built late enough to benefit from advanced design, deep enough to avoid surface disruption, strong enough to resist collapse, accessible enough to restore safely. But beyond those technical reasons lies something deeper. This tunnel told a complete story, from ambition to dominance, to obsolescence, to memory. It allowed Niagara's hidden history to be experienced, not imagined. The light that rarely reaches below today. The Toronto Power Tunnel stands alone. All across Niagara, other underground systems remain submerged, sealed, or destroyed. They cannot be entered. They cannot be seen. They exist only as shadows beneath the rock. This is the only place where the public crosses the boundary between surface spectacle and buried reality. The only moment where humanity returned not to exploit, but to remember. A final irony: Niagara Falls was once conquered with tunnels, turbines, and stone. Then those systems were abandoned when they were no longer useful. Now only one has been resurrected, not to generate electricity, but to generate understanding. In the end, the greatest power this tunnel produces is not measured in watts. It is measured in perspective. Because once you walk beneath Niagara Falls, you never see the surface the same way again. When tunnels became a tomb, the moment nature took everything back. For nearly half a century, Niagara Falls had been subdued by engineering. Stone was drilled. Steel was anchored into cliffs. Water was disciplined, captured, measured, and redirected through tunnels and penstocks that turned chaos into power. By the mid-20th century, the Sholkoff Power Station stood as the ultimate symbol of that conquest. And then, in 1956, it all ended in a single afternoon. The most powerful station on the American side. The Sholkoff complex did not appear overnight. Built in stages between 1904 and 1924, it grew into the largest and most powerful hydroelectric installation on the American side of Niagara Falls. Unlike earlier plants, Sholkoff was not a single facility, it was a network. Multiple generating houses, massive intake conduits spread across the plateau, steel penstocks plunging more than 150 feet down the gorge wall, a shared system of underground tail race tunnels carrying discharged water away. Below the surface, the underground works formed a labyrinth-wide passages, narrow maintenance corridors, and intersecting discharge routes engineered to prevent backflow and overload. It was advanced, it was efficient, and it was pushed to the limits of early 20th century engineering. For decades, it worked. The first warning. On the afternoon of the 7th of June, 1956, workers noticed something unusual. A small seep of water had appeared behind one of the station's retaining walls. At first, it seemed insignificant, a routine drainage issue common in structures built into rock faces. But within hours, the seep became a crack. The crack widened, and then the ground itself began to move. What engineers quickly realized too late was that this was not a structural failure of concrete or steel. It was a geological failure. The gorge wall was giving way. When the cliff collapsed, Niagara's gorge is ancient, layered, and unstable in places, especially where softer shale lies beneath harder dolomite. For decades, the immense weight and vibration of Sholkoff's infrastructure had pressed against that delicate balance. On June 7th, gravity finally won. Sections of the gorge wall sheared away, undermining the foundations that anchored the penstocks to the cliff face. As the rock shifted, the steel penstocks, each carrying enormous volumes of pressurized water, tore free from their mountings. They ripped through the generating houses like weapons. Floors collapsed, walls shattered. Water surged where it was never meant to go, flooding the underworld. The true catastrophe happened below. As penstocks ruptured, water poured directly into the underground system. The tail race tunnels designed to carry water away smoothly were suddenly overwhelmed from every direction. Within minutes, they became death traps. Entire underground chambers flooded instantly. Access routes vanished. Machinery was destroyed beyond recovery. 3 generating houses, stations 3A, 3B, and 3C, were obliterated in a matter of hours. Some structures collapsed into the river itself. Others were crushed beneath falling rock. What had taken decades to build was erased in a single day. The end of an era. Remarkably, there was no mass loss of life, but the damage was absolute. Schoellkopf was never repaired. It was never rebuilt. It was never reopened. The disaster sent shock waves through the American energy establishment. The lesson was unmistakable. Distributed hydro plants carved into unstable geology were no longer acceptable. Nature had made that decision clear. Within years, the United States committed fully to centralized, large-scale hydroelectric generation, leading directly to the expansion of the Robert Moses Niagara power plant upstream. The era of scattered powerhouses clinging to the gorge was over. Tunnels as graves today, what remains of Schoellkopf exists only in fragments. Broken stone walls cling to the gorge, staircases lead to nothing. Markers outline buildings that no longer stand. And beneath it all, the tunnels are gone, collapsed, flooded, buried beneath debris and river sediment. They are no longer infrastructure. They are tombs, nature's final word. For decades, humanity believed it had mastered Niagara Falls. The Schoellkopf disaster proved otherwise. The river had been patient. The rock had endured. But the moment came when the balance tipped, not with a roar but with a crack. In that instant, Niagara reclaimed its authority, and the tunnels once symbols of human dominance became silent, evidence of a truth engineers eventually accepted. You can borrow power from nature, but you never own it. What was buried was not erased. Today, Niagara Falls presents a familiar image to the world. Water thunders over the brink. Mist rises into the air. Tourists lean over railings, cameras raised, believing they are witnessing something timeless and untouched. But that is only the surface. Above ground, the past survives in fragments. Crumbling stone walls clinging to the gorge, sealed intake portals hidden behind fences, historic power stations standing empty, their windows dark. These are the visible scars. The true legacy lies beneath their feet, a world still down there. Under the sidewalks, parks, parking lots, and observation decks, kilometers of tunnels still exist. They do not lead anywhere anymore. They are not mapped for the public. They have no entrances. Most are flooded slowly, filled over decades by groundwater and seepage. Others are collapsed, sealed, or deliberately buried to stabilize the land above. Brick arches remain intact in places. Stone linings still hold against pressure. Empty voids stretch through dolomite and shale, perfectly preserved by darkness and water. No signs, no markers, no acknowledgement. These tunnels were not demolished. They were simply left behind. Niagara redefined. Niagara Falls is not just a natural wonder. It is also one of the largest industrial graveyards in North America. An underground city built for power. A maze carved to discipline a river. A forgotten infrastructure that once lit factories, powered cities, and proved that electricity could travel across continents. What visitors admire today, the raw force of nature exists alongside what they never see. the remains of humanity's most ambitious attempt to control it. Niagara is not only a waterfall, it is a palimpsest, where nature and industry occupy the same space, layered on top of one another. The lesson beneath the falls. The tunnels teach a quiet but unforgiving lesson. Human innovation is extraordinary. Engineering can redirect rivers. Stone can be hollowed. Power can be pulled from chaos, but none of it is permanent. Every tunnel was built with confidence. Every power station was designed to last. Every generation believed its solutions were final. History proved otherwise. Technology moved on. Politics shifted. Nature pushed back. And when those forces changed, the tunnels were no longer needed. So they were sealed, flooded, and forgotten. Not because they failed, but because the world outgrew them. Nature remains. The river still flows. The gorge still erodes. The falls continue their slow retreat upstream, inch by inch, year after year, utterly indifferent to what humans once carved into its rock. The tunnels did not defeat Niagara. They only borrowed time from it. In the end, nature did not need to destroy every structure. It only had to outlast them. A question for you. So the next time you see Niagara Falls, ask yourself, are we looking at a timeless natural wonder, or standing on top of a buried civilization that believed it had conquered one? And if these tunnels could disappear from memory so completely, what parts of our world will one day lie hidden beneath the surface? If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing to support deep historical documentaries like this one. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you see these tunnels as triumphs of human ingenuity, or warnings carved in stone? And if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten layers beneath famous places, let us know what story you want explored next. Because some histories don't vanish, they just go underground.